scatter plots. So we've done graphing, and most of the graphing that we've done has been putting points on a coordinate plane, and they've been linear. So we've seen that they actually line up perfectly, and actually we can see a line through them. We can use an equation to take a look at that pattern. A scatter plot doesn't really necessarily line up so specifically. So for some reason you have points, x's and y values that go together, and we're putting them on a coordinate plane and kind of looking for patterns. We're kind of interpreting the information from the scatter plot. So let's see what we can do with some scatter plots here. So interpreting a scatter plot. So first of all, a scatter plot is a graph that shows the relationship between two data sets. The two sets of data are graphed as ordered pairs in a coordinate plane. So we're going to have our coordinate plane here. We've got our x and our y axes, and we've got some points there. You'll notice there's not a line through them. They're not linear, but they definitely seem to have some kind of a pattern to them. If we looked at what kind of a pattern they were, they do seem to have a relationship between each other. But what we can do is we can answer some questions and get some information from a scatter plot. So let's answer some questions. So this graph, it talks about restaurant sandwiches and the fat grams compared to the calories in those sandwiches. So we've taken two pieces of data from those sandwiches and we've plotted them on a coordinate plane. So first question, how many grams of fat are in the sandwich that contains 740 calories? So I'm going to look on my calorie axis here. I'm going to go up to my 740, and I'm going to look for how many grams of fat that is. So I'm going to come across here, and my 740 is about here. So I come down, and it's between 40 and 45. So I'm going to go with 42, something in the middle of the 40 and 45 there. So about 42 grams of fat in the 740 calorie sandwich. Second question, how many calories are in a sandwich that contains 33 grams of fat? So I'm going to go over here to my 33 grams of fat. I'm going to go up to about here, and we've got about 640 calories in that particular sandwich. So again, we're going to look on the graph when we're going to go either vertically or horizontally or vertically to figure out the other piece of data that goes with the piece we've been given. All right, what else can we get from scatter plots? We can talk about the relationships between the data. So we can look at the data and decide, is there a relationship with our sandwiches? Is there a relationship between how many grams of fat there are and how many calories? And when we looked at that graph, it did seem to be that the more calories were in a sandwich, the more grams of fat were in the sandwich. Those two did seem to be related to each other. So there are certain things we can tell about the relationship between data. So what we're going to do is we're going to describe the relationship between the data. And how we're going to describe that? Positive linear or negative linear. So we've looked at linear relationships. And when we think about linear, we think very much a line, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect line. We just want to look at it like there's a flow to it. And if you imagine a river that was very straight, or a road, a very straight road, we could imagine that, yes, these points really seem to kind of follow that same straight path. If we think more about a road, where it's kind of a wider line than that, kind of a band. The positive and the negative, thinking about our slope. So a positive slope going from the left to the right going up, and our negative slope from the left to the right going down. So we're still, that positive negative still relating to a slope. Nonlinear, it could have a pattern to it, but it's not necessarily a straight line. So it could have a curve to it. We can see where kind of things are heading, but it's not necessarily perfectly linear. Or there's no relationship at all. These two things do not seem to have anything to do with each other. So the first thing we're going to do is describe the relationship. Next, we're going to identify any outliers, clusters, or gaps. So we're going to see if there are any of those in our data. And the last thing we're going to do is interpret the relationship. All right, so let's take a look at this first graph. We've got television size and price. So on my x-axis, I have the size of a television in inches, and on my y-axis, I have the price of the television in dollars. So, describe the relationship. Well, it definitely seems that there is a linear relationship here, and if you take your pencil and put it on your paper, you could almost take your pencil, where's my marker here? You could take your pencil and I could really put it over the points like this way. Now, this guy over here is doing his own thing. We don't need all of them to follow the pattern. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we can see a general relationship. Sometimes there are those things that kind of are outside the norm, but in general, these seem to follow a very linear pattern when I put my pencil or my pen over them. Now, it's not a pattern that looks like this. That doesn't seem to follow most of them. It's not a pattern that looks like this. If I really want to cover them all, it kind of goes this way. So I do see a linear relationship here. And again, if we think about positive or negative, that's a positive line. So it has a positive linear relationship. Outliers, clusters, or gaps. Let's start with outliers. Outliers are points that don't tend to follow the trend here. So we do have this guy over here. He's an outlier. We've got a very large TV for a very low price, so maybe that was like some super sale or something that had a dent in it or whatnot. So for some reason, this guy's kind of out of the ordinary here. If we go to social studies, it's a free thinker. So we've got this one that's an outlier. So it's an outlier, and we're going to estimate here 7. It's in between 2,000 and 2,500, so about 70, 2,225, somewhere in there. Clusters. Clusters are exactly what it sounds like. It is a group of points that for some reason seem like they're really close together. So we have a cluster down here. Now you can kind of describe where it is in multiple ways. You can describe where the points are. So you could say cluster at about 3,400 or so. We could also just tell where it is on the x-axis. We could say the cluster is about x equals 30 or 30 inches for our size of our TV. Gaps. Gaps, just like it sounds like, there's a hole in the data. So you kind of notice that there's no flow. We're missing a piece in the middle. And we have a gap in here. So we have a gap from about $500 to about $1,500 in there. There seems to be a missing spot. So a few different ways that you can describe where those outliers, clusters, and gaps are. If you don't see one, you do want to say there's no gaps in this data, so that we make sure we know you didn't skip it. It's that you're recognizing there aren't any in there. And the last question, interpret the relationship. So remember, the word interpret is asking us to kind of take it from math into English. So we're taking it from my classroom into the English classroom. So what does that actually mean? So what can we learn about the size and the price by looking at this graph? And going by this kind of relationship that we have here, we're noticing that as the TV size increases, the price also increases. Short and simple. Okay, and we've looked at interpreting from graphs before. And our last graph here, we've got the age and your pets owned. My x-axis is your age in years. My y-axis is the number of pets. And as I look at these points, I don't see any relationship there at all. They seem to be all over the place here. So there's no relationship. These do not seem to have a relationship. And since there's no relationship, I can't really describe anything that's outside of the norm here. I don't seem to have any clusters. I don't seem to have any big gaps. They're just kind of all over the place here. And since there's no relationship, I can't interpret the relationship. So once I've got that no relationship, I'm kind of done with it. So we can get information from a graph to answer some questions, and we can also talk about the relationship of the data based on a scatter plot.